received legal advice on changes to the personnel chapters, and we also had a discussion about whether to waive legal privilege and publish the legal advice concerning Route 410 that the city attorney gave to us last week, and we decided that we would make that public, and it will be a revised version for public release, and it will be released tomorrow, November 16th. So that will be available sometime tomorrow. My sense is probably sometime later in the day. And I also wanted to note, there was the other thing that I wanted to do was to check with folks. We had at the end of the discussion last week, we had a little kind of a summarization of where things were, and I used some language about the annexation of Flower Avenue having a whole calendar that would need to be followed if we were going to proceed with that, and we all kind of nodded yes, we agreed with something about the calendar, but I wanted to bring that back and make sure that we had a clear sense of what we wanted to do, because if we go ahead with the process, we would have to start putting that into effect next week. So I wanted to make sure that people had a chance to say what you wanted to do, because I think basically, if the city manager can see if I'm stating this correctly, and if not, correct me, that if we say yes in terms of starting that whole calendar rolling, we're not saying that, yes, we have definitely decided to do the annexation. That comes as part of that process. But to go ahead and start that process so that if we want to do that, we have gotten that rolling rather than having it pushed way out, and it's a long process to do. So is everybody comfortable with things like having something on the agenda next week that starts that process rolling?
Can I just clarify?
Yes.
So that starts the process rolling, but we could decide not to annex at some point if
Correct.
If we decided not to reach an agreement with the state highway about taking over the road.
Or if we said, there's the decoupling that we talked about, and this was an entirely separate process, and State Highway agreed that it's entirely separate, and that it's a discussion all its own.
Great.
Okay, so we will put that on the agenda next week. And then I just wanted to note that in addition to that item next week, we also are having a presentation about the Small Community Grant Review from the Small Community Grant Review Committee. We'll have a resolution adopting a flood mitigation plan, and we'll have a resolution authorizing the city manager to sign a memorandum of understanding regarding use of Tacoma Piney Branch Park. And then our main work session agenda item next week will be the continuing discussion of the recommendations of the Task Force on Environmental Action, and we will follow that up the following week, November 29th, with continued discussion of the recommendations of the Task Force on Environmental Action. We had originally been hoping to have 2 weeks of that discussion and 2 weeks of the tree ordinance revisions in what remains of our small number of meetings this calendar year, but because we shifted everything around last week and jettisoned things left and right, we couldn't fit all of that in, and we didn't want to break up the discussions and have 1 week of one item and 1 week of another item and then skip to next January and pick it up again. We wanted to maintain that continuity and try and get through one thing and delay the other. So we'll have the Task Force on Environmental Action work session next week, where we'll continue where we left off. However far we get, we will then continue that on the 29th, but no matter what, we will have comments from the Task Force on Environmental Action members as part of that discussion on the 29th. They've already been notified that they will be part of that discussion. So even if we don't get all the way to the end of going through the staff comments on the Task Force on Environmental Action, we will provide an opportunity for the members of the task force to engage in the discussion with us. So I just wanted to kind of let folks know that that is what's going to be upcoming in the last two meetings after this meeting, which constitute the remainder of our meetings for this calendar year.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
And so the forced ranking and prioritization that we're going to do on the strategic plan to impact the budget will come in January, not before the end.
We're going to get that from the city manager and do that as soon as she has it ready, but then the revisiting of that will, of necessity, have to be in January.
And the second thing is just related to the task force and the environment, because we're going to go through all those discussions in work session, get input from the committee members, to our task force members. Are we, but we're not reaching a conclusion about what our prioritization is about that?
It would be nice if we could, but we may not have the time necessary to do that, depending on how long we can talk about it next week. If we get through the rest of that, of the staff discussion next week, we could potentially have the interaction with the members of the task force and come to some tentative conclusions about what our priorities are on the 29th. It's all a question of time.
So I don't know if there's a way we can construct it so that we make sure we do that, because my fear would be that we'd have all that rich discussion, and then we're going to come to actually, if we don't do that by the end of the meeting on the 29th, then we're not going to reload on it until January,
right.
And then we all can be forgetful sometimes about those discussions, and then, so I don't know if there's some way we can construct it to make sure that we do set priorities coming out of that discussion, so.
That would be
we don't
nice.
have to decide it tonight.
We'll try and set the agenda so that there's time for that. It may also require all of us to be focused in our discussion and remember that we're trying to do that and have enough time so that we're not doing it at 2 o'clock in the morning on November 30th. But we will try and make that happen. Okay. So we're now at the public comment period for anybody who'd like to comment on anything that's not on our special session agenda this evening. If anybody would like to make any public comment. And if you can identify yourself, and please keep your comments to 3 minutes. Thanks.
My name is Larry Silverman. I live at Birch Avenue. I also own the S&A Beads. I'd like to talk to you about energy in the commercial sector. The post office needs a new roof. It ought to be a solar roof. It's an ideal location. There are many incentives and opportunities now that may not be there in the future, and moreover, once the roof is there, it will not be redone. So there's one opportunity. You may ask yourself, well, here is a private property owner and a tenant. What does the city council have to do with it? Well, I think the economic prosperity of the city and its future, your future tax revenues, depend in part upon the city sort of living up to the image it projects proudly to the world. And also, I think it would be very helpful to working with the post office to insulate at least part of the city, the commercial sector of the city, from the energy shocks and price shocks that may be coming, which I think probably are coming. And we're talking here 20 to 30 year period. I think the key to it is to persuade the post office that it really wants this. Now, the post office, as it turns out, as a department, is the largest owner of solar energy facilities in the world. They do it in many places, particularly in California, and it ought to be done here. And what I'm asking, without being too specific, is that the mayor and the council involve themselves with the landlord, with the post office, with the congressional delegation, and others who might be influential in this area to try to persuade the post office to pay the initial additional costs of the solar roof. which would benefit every one of the tenants in that block. And once it was done, I expect, and it was visible, it would be very good for business, very good for our image. I'm sure of that. And also it might set examples that others in the community would follow. So I know the country is supposed to be turning its back on all things environmentally sensible, but I expect Tacoma Park isn't doing that. And the opportunity, for two reasons, is limited in time. One is once the roof is in, it's in. And secondly, the incentives, which are very generous, will not be around in the future. So I hope you consider this, and I'd be happy to talk with you privately about it. Thank you so much.
Good, thank you. Be happy to talk about that and see if there's anything we can do. Is there anybody else who'd like to make any public comment? Okay, seeing none.
Larry, hang on one second.
Sorry. Council comments, or was it a question for?
I have a council comment which relates to that.
Okay, go ahead.
Last week I attended a meeting on Sycamore Avenue of a nascent solar cooperative. It was a serious discussion of how to create a solar cooperative in town. And one of the questions was where to put a substantial number of solar panels. And I've had a short discussion with Darrell Braithwaite about the possibility of putting solar panels on our Public Works Department. And there's this building as well, which could accommodate more solar panels. And Darrell told me that there are discussions right now with vendors, solar vendors, and that it may be that in the future there's an RFP or some kind of request for not necessarily a proposal or an RF something that will go out for public works building and for this building. The discussion about potentially being a solar cooperative was based in part on discussions with folks over in College Park and University Park, where there is such a beast. And it brings together private investors who aren't going to make a lot of money, but will make some money, pool money, and then see that money returned to them. And there are a variety of ways that that money can be returned, partly through the generous returns on that investment by government entities, and partly through, I can't remember the initials for this exactly, REC, REX, I think it is, whereby the utilities are under compunction of putting in a certain amount of alternative energies, and they can then purchase rights to claim that production by others. So I just wanted to note that that discussion is going on in Tacoma Park, and I'll bring back to that nascent cooperative the notion of putting it on the post office as well.
Councilmember Wright, did you have something?
Yes, thank you. Had two issues. One is the issue of the work that's going on Maple Avenue by Pepco. There's three issues there, sub-issues. They're replacing a lot of the poles on Maple Avenue, which I think is important, but they have not properly notified residents of the work schedule or what their plans are. So, you know, the road was shut down in the middle of the day, and people couldn't get in or out of their houses, and there was no notice given about this. Or not in or out, they couldn't pull their cars up close to their house. There was no notice given about it. It's unclear if that's going to happen again. There's no parking signs out from the 16th to the 19th. When the signs went up, this is the first people heard of it. There's no understanding, I presume, they're going to change over the lines somehow, and so you'd presume that the power is going to be out for some period of time when they do that. It might only be a short period of time, but again, no one's been given notice, so I've mentioned this to Darrell Braithwaite. I think we need to work with Pepco to get proper notification. I think they've told the city that they've provided notification to residents about this work, but I live on that block, and I was given no notification about it, and all the people I've heard from have been given no notification clarification. And then lastly, they're replacing the poles, but it's unclear of the time frame under which they're going to also replace the lights that are on those poles. So if we get some clarification on all that. And then I got a report from a city resident that there's a number of the street lights that are city-owned on Carroll Avenue that are out right now. So I don't know all the locations, but I think it's a short drive to go down to figure out which ones of those are in the evening, which ones are out in the evening. Thank you.
Councilmember Clay.
We received a lot of email last week and follow-up inquiries on the Route 410 issues. One of the questions that I got was whether or not the city had provided any notice to the residents about the transfer, and we looked through the city newsletter, and last month's newsletter had essentially the primary #1 spot on the newspaper, which is the front cover of the newspaper. In the first column there was a story about it, and remind folks that the city newsletter is the city's kind of primary communication to residents across the community, and there are some great feature stories in it that tells you different things that are going on, but it also contains a lot of content about what's happening in the city and upcoming important issues. And so I would encourage people to at least take a look at the headlines to see if there's something there that affects you personally. I also wanted to let the other council members know that I am on the board of the Seasons of Life Birth Center. You guys may remember that. Amy Polk came and spoke to us very passionately about that, and I wanted to let you all know that it's still moving forward, and the board is actually active and engaged in looking to site the facility within Tacoma Park and moving forward with their business plan, and that's very exciting, both from the perspective of having a birthing center in Tacoma Park. Both of my kids were born at home, so familiarity with the midwives and people wanting to have control over their own birth, and I really enjoy that part. And also because I think this is part of Amy Polk's legacy, and community is such a big part of the community during the time that I was a council member, so I really enjoy working on that.
Okay, any other comments? I just wanted to note a couple quick things. First, I wanted to say that I thought it was a really nice dedication of Belle Ziegler Park yesterday, and I wanted to note particularly the outstanding effort put forth by City Clerk Jesse Carpenter in making that possible, and we really appreciate that. And there were about 75 people plus the Tacoma Park Community Band, and I think people really enjoyed that that park dedication. And people did note that there was still one sign that said Jackie A. Park in the park, and I'm assuming that Public Works is going to take care of that sign. And the sign that was unveiled as part of the dedication is a very nice sign that has a lot of information, some good pictures. So if people haven't been aware that that park was changing, it is now officially changed, and there's some great information there on the new sign by the shelter at the corner of the park, and it's worth going to take a look and seeing all about the history of that park. I also wanted to let folks know that I had an enjoyable time this morning. I went to talk to the 7th and 8th graders at John Nevins Andrews School on Elm Avenue, and they have a career day every Monday morning, and they have people come in and talk about their careers, and they wanted me to talk about my job as mayor. It was very interesting talking to those students. They started out the morning a little bit asleep. It was 8:30 on a Monday morning, and they probably had a long, rough weekend, and they weren't quite awake yet, but After they woke up, they were fully engaged in the conversation, and I had a hard time getting out of there. It was supposed to be a half-hour conversation. It went well over an hour, and there were still many more questions. And so I advised them maybe the next person they wanted to invite was Chief Rakucci, and they said they would do that, and I've already told him of that, and he said he'd be glad to go. And it was a fascinating discussion, and I can share some of the observations with my colleagues if you're interested. And the final thing I just wanted to note was that, to remind my colleagues that the Maryland Municipal League Montgomery County chapter meeting is this Wednesday evening in Gaithersburg, and if anybody needs a ride, I'm going. And I'm still not sure whether our invited speaker will be there. That's new, about to be Councilmember Craig Rice. I know that Councilmember Hans Remer has a conflict and will not be there, but we'll still try and schedule something with him at a later date. Next, we have city manager's comments.
The only thing I was just going to note for the record is that the quarterly financial report and the quarterly update on city activities is included in your agenda packet.
Thank you. And then we have adoption of minutes. We have one set of minutes from September 7th. Would somebody like to move their adoption?
Move. Second.
It's been moved and seconded. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? The ayes have it. So we will move to our next agenda item, which is a presentation on the FY 2010 Comprehensive Annual Financial Report.
I believe Ms. Brooks just ran out to get the auditors.
Okay, we're actually about 3 minutes ahead of schedule.
It works, it works.
That's keeping our trap shut, that is.
Yep.
Yes.
Come on down. Oh, well, then you'll have to do it all.
I believe.
Do what you can. If you have good news to tell us, go ahead. If you have bad news, just say, oh, they're not here, they can't tell you.
Okay, good afternoon. I'm Yvonne Brooks, the Director of Finance for the City of Tacoma Park. As you know, we are required to have an annual audit, both by the city charter and the state requirements. There's a state law that we must have an independent audit conducted on our basic financial statements. Annually, the auditors are expected to be here to make a presentation of the audit report. Their sole responsibility is to express an opinion on the financial statements based upon their review. The financial statements and most of the information in the report is a product of management. And basically, the pages that pertain to the audit are 2 pages. I believe it's page 10 and 11 in our audit in our comprehensive annual financial report. The audit was conducted in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards, and these standards are applicable, and the standards applicable to financial audits contained in the government auditing standards, which is issued by the Comptroller General of the United States of America. And these standards require that the auditing firm plan and perform the audit to attain reasonable assurance about whether our financial statements are free of material misstatement. The auditor's opinion on our financial statement basically says that our financial statements present fairly in all material respects the respective financial position of the governmental activities, each major fund, and the aggregate remaining fund information of the City of Tacoma Park, Maryland as of June 30th, 2010, and the respective changes in the financial position and the budgetary comparison of the General Fund, the Community Center Fund, and the City Camera Fund for the year then ended in conformity with the accounting principles generally accepted in the United States of America. Basically, the major funds are the general fund, the community center fund, and the speed camera fund. And the other remaining funds are considered non-major funds. And there's an exercise the auditors go through to make that determination, and it deals with revenue, the percentage of revenues and expenditures, and elements of the balance sheet. The audit, the comprehensive annual financial statement has basically three components. The first is government-wide financial statements, which looks at the city as a whole from the point of view similar to a commercial operation, where all of the assets, whether they're current or non-current, are shown, and all the liabilities, the current liabilities and the long-term liabilities. So it gives a presentation of the city as if it was a business, and that would be the financial statement that's on page 28 and 29. And this is the financial statement that a bank or financial institution may be interested in. Based on this financial statement on page 28, the total assets of the city, both current and long-term, is $38,548,037. Our total liabilities basically come to $8.8 million, which means that we have net assets or equity in the city of about $29.7 million. If you go to the next page, page 29 basically shows the statement of activities, and the emphasis is on the expenditures, which is the first column. This presents all the funds combined to certain functions and programs. So our total expenditures would come to $23,055,449,000. And you have to keep in mind that general government includes the cable operations related to the cable grant, and public safety includes the speed camera. Public works includes stormwater as well as public works. Housing and community development is basically housing and community development. And recreation and culture entails both the library, recreation, and the media or communications division. Okay, our auditors have arrived. We have with us from Clifton and Gunderson the partner on the engagement, who is Greg Bussink, and the senior audit manager, Aries Coleman.
Hello. Sorry for being a few minutes late.
That's all right. You were 3 minutes late, we were 3 minutes early, so.
Okay.
You'll be holding a rare thing where we're 3 minutes early.
I want to thank you for the opportunity to present tonight to you guys. We completed our financial statement audit this year, similar timing to last year. I believe everyone has a copy of the CAFR or seen a copy of the CAFR, the Comprehensive Annual Financial Report, and familiar with the results. So I just want to go over a couple of things that we need to cover professionally that we're required to do. And then if you have any questions for us, feel free to let us know. So I do want to point out that in the financial statements on page 10 of the financial statements, the independent auditor's report, Yolanda and her team put together pretty much everything in the entire comprehensive financial report, and we provide the opinion on the financial statements. So a lot of hard work goes in by management to prepare this document, and we want to thank them for all their help and give them credit because they spent a lot of time and effort to get this right and have it in good shape. So within our financial statement, our opinion, very similar to what you've seen in the past. with the comprehensive annual financial report, the financial statements are broken up into opinion units. So you may see in a couple places where we say we express opinions rather than just an opinion on the financial statement. So the opinion units are broken out. In the first sentence, you can see governmental activities, each major fund, and the aggregate remaining fund information. So within that, there are separate opinion units. So we do issue different levels of assurance. Or I should say we issue assurance on different opinion units within the financial statements. Second paragraph points out that we did conduct our audit in accordance with generally accepted auditing standards in the U.S. and government auditing standards issued by the GAO. One thing I meant to point out in the first paragraph, I apologize for not catching it before, was that the last two sentences point out who's responsible for what in the financial statement audit process. Management is responsible for the financial statements. Our responsibility is to express opinions on the statements based on our audit. Third paragraph is really where we say what we did or the results of our audit, and effectively it's an unqualified opinion, also called a clean opinion. So it's the best form of assurance that you can get on your financial statements. It's what you want. So what we're saying is that everything within the financial statements is presented fairly in accordance with GAAP, or accounting principles. It does make reference, the fourth paragraph, to a separate report that we will issue in accordance with government auditing standards. And since the city is subject to single audit this year, you have enough grant money to go over the limit to require a single audit. We're actually working on that now. There will be a separate set of single audit report that's issued, and as part of that package, the government auditing standards report on internal control and compliance with laws and regulations is also included in that package. So that will be issued in the next couple weeks as we wrap that up. The next couple pages, page 11, the next couple paragraphs, go into different levels. Within the financial statements, there's a lot of information. There's management discussion and analysis, an introductory section, there's a financial section, statistical section. And as auditors, we provide different levels of assurance on that. So management discussion and analysis and pension information, we look at compared overall to the financial statements for consistency. And the next paragraph goes into some other detail in the introductory section, the statistical section, et cetera. So that's what I really have to cover within the financial statements. I know that you guys have gone over the results of operations in the past and things like that. So in addition, we just want to point out a few things. I did mention that we did conduct our audit in accordance with government auditing standards and U.S. GAS, or generally accepted auditing standards. I mentioned within the financial statements there are different sections and different levels of assurance that we provide. A few other things that we need to discuss with you. As far as issues that we were involved in the process, as far as the procurement process, we were hired under a competitive procurement process a few years ago. So any issues related to opinion shopping really wouldn't apply now because there's been competitive procurement there. Really no new accounting standards this year that kicked in that really had a significant impact on the city. There were a few new GASBs, ones related to derivative financial statements, which the city does not have any derivatives, so it didn't have any impact on you there. GASB 54, which is coming for next year, which is the new fund balance reporting requirements, will be a change for next year a little bit in the presentation of the financial statements. But it won't have a significant impact on the operations of the cities. It's just going to be a different presentation of how you present fund balance. As far as dealing with management was very helpful. We want to thank them again for their assistance. During our audit, we didn't have any corrections that we had to propose, any adjustments, so the financial statements were pretty clean from that perspective. And at the end of our engagement, management provided us with a representation letter where they reaffirmed certain things that they told us during the audit. That's really everything that we need to cover from the auditor's perspective that professional standards warrant us to discuss with you. Now we'd just like to open it up for any questions. Well, I guess, Eric, you want to give them a briefing on where we stand with the single audit?
Okay. Good evening. As Greg mentioned earlier, the city spent more than $500,000 of federal monies, and so that triggered your Single Audit Act, and we are conducting an audit in accordance with Circular A-133. Where that's different than the regular financial audit, it's basically the federal government has laid out different compliance requirements that these monies have to be spent in accordance with. and we're looking at those compliance requirements to make sure that the city was in compliance as they spent the money, did the reporting, and so forth, set forth by the grant agreements. The audit will be issued by 11:30. One of the grantor agencies has requested the audit to be issued earlier than what the federal government is allowing, so we will be issuing the audit within the next couple of weeks. I just want to give you, because we've pretty much done the testing, and we just have to go through our internal review process, so I cannot say this is definite, but I just want to give you an update on where we are. It was 2 programs. We had one that was an EDI program, which basically helped with the auditorium, which looks very nice. I didn't know it was done already.
Really nice.
It does. That was one grant, and then another grant was for the Green Roof and Linden Avenue projects, which have been on the way and or pretty much completed. So with those 2 programs, we made sure that the monies were spent in accordance with Circular OMB, A133 guidance, as well as the grantor guidance and any other state compliance requirements that may be applicable to those funds. As of today, we have not found any compliance issues that are required to be reported in the Circular A133. The final determination comes after all the reviews are done, so as I stated before, I can't say it's definite, but I have not brought anything to Greg's attention that will be requiring us to report that in the single audit. And I want to say that is a testament to your staff, because the city has not had a single audit, I think, in quite some time, and the requirements, especially under ERA and the Transparency Act, the requirements are stringent. The federal oversight agencies, the state oversight agencies are definitely taking heed to how the grantees are reporting. So for no compliance issues or internal control issues to be reported under A133, that is a compliment to your staff, the management team. I know the Director of Public Works, also I know that the Deputy City Manager, all were program managers with these funds, so that's a good thing to say. Along with that, just want to touch on management letter comments. We do not have any management letter comments this year for the city, and if I'm not mistaken, last year there were no management letter comments at all, so I have no update to report on where they stand.
Good. So, clean opinion,
Yes,
no management comments.
correct.
Looks like a good signal audit. It's all good news.
That is good news.
Good, thank you. Questions? Councilmember Wright.
I just had a question on the second to last paragraph, where you talked about the historical pension information. Sure. So I understand it sounds like it's not in the purview of a normal audit to look into deeply our pension obligations, but it is an issue that's of concern to some of the council members, and so my question would be sort of, could we, as the council, ask you in the future years to do a deeper investigation or dive into our pension obligations, outstanding pension obligations, and unfunded liabilities related to that, if we wanted an opinion from you on that topic, and if it was an area that we should be concerned about? We get a report on these issues, and it's a little bit, always a little bit, I think, confusing to some of the members of the council, and I'm sure to members of the public. But it is an area of concern, the size of our unfunded pension liabilities, and what that means for the long-term financial stability for the city.
Okay.
Does that question make sense?
It does make sense, and it's an often confused area, and with the opinion units and the level of assurance that we provide at different levels. Within the financial statements, if you look, you'll see that there's no liability right now for your pension. That's because you're fully funded at the level where you need to be. If you look back, it's on page 63, is the required supplemental information that we're making reference to in that second to last paragraph. What that shows is, it's showing historical information for certain information that basically over time, so it's showing the historical trends there. But as part of our financial statement audit, we do look, if you look, our opinions cover everything in the financial statements in the notes for the most part. So as you go through, you'll see for the, page 60. Page 60 includes condensed financial information. And as part of that, we do perform auditing procedures. We perform participant testing over eligibility of folks in the plan. We confirm the investments. Your actuarial liability is actually prepared by outside actuaries, and we actually confirm directly with them. We have a pretty good knowledge of the actuarial firms around, but we know that they're a reputable firm, they're a good firm, their information is usually pretty reliable. So we confirm that they are independent of the city as part of the process. So there's a great deal of audit procedures that go on. Really what this is saying is this section on page 63, which is requires supplemental information. You may hear it called RSI. This information here, we don't go through and audit back all the prior years. A lot of the information has been audited in prior years, but for this year, we wouldn't go back and re-audit those numbers. And those can be a little confusing.
So, but you said we have no liability related to this, but then if you look at something called total unfunded actuarially accrued liabilities, the number is $10 million. So I know this is confusing, and maybe this is why I think it might be helpful to have a kind of deeper dive at some point to help us understand this issue. I don't know if the city manager wants to.
What I was going to say is I think what Greg was referring to is that the city has been contributing at the actuarial recommended rate. I think the issue, Councilmember Wright, you're raising is a different one. I think if on the police pension plan, if the council is interested, we could certainly make arrangements to have the actuary for the plan come in, because they might be a more appropriate party to address the questions about unfunded liability than the city's auditors.
Because that overall liability over time gets amortized over the period of the folks that, over their expected lifetime, takes in some other factors into it. So when it goes to the actuary, and I'm not an actuary, first thing I'll tell you, I'm not an attorney either. Just to point out that for accounting purposes, there is, within that amortization period, a certain amount of liability that would be recorded. So if you had underfunded or chose not to fund the required pension amount that's required to keep you fully funded out over time, you would have a liability on your books. I think 2 years ago there was, maybe even last year, there was a small liability on the books. But I think in the prior years you had funded 99%, and this year there was a 103, 106. There was a bigger percentage to catch it up in the liability for the unfunded portion that's required to be made over time went away. Now it's actually a little bit, you're actually a little bit overfunded as far as the requirements to meet the amortized liability.
So I'm more confused than I started, which is
really confusing.
So I think your advice, City Manager Matthews, probably makes sense. Obviously, it's not an urgent matter. I know there's many urgent issues we're trying to deal with before we go on break, but I think it would be helpful to me at least, and I suspect it would be helpful at least to Councilmember Robinson as well.
We'll try and schedule that next year.
Great.
Other questions, Councilmember Robinson?
I'll very quickly follow up, because I do share this confusion, I guess it is. And there's, on page 61, there's a note, then note 12, about risks and uncertainties, which specifically addresses the police and employee retirement plan and the defined contribution plan, and that there is a level of risk there. City Manager Matthews, you talked specifically just now about the police plan, but I would like to make sure that we also include both of our plans when we have an analysis done on a level of risk.
Yeah, I can see what we can do about someone at the state. The reason I specifically mentioned the police plan is that is essentially the city's own plan as opposed to our being a participant in the state plan. But I can certainly see what arrangements we could make with the state. But we're not the ones administering that plan. We are the police plan.
We need a risk analysis, and part of the concern that some of us have here is that we put $1.5 million into the pot last year, so that was kind of a shocker to some of us. Thank you.
Other questions? I've got a couple quick ones, and I think they're mostly for Ms. Brooks. On page 49, note 7, which is the various amounts due from other governments. I just wanted to get a quick sense from you about whether any of those are out of the ordinary, or there's any issues attached to those, or those are just the normal things that are expected. I know that we've had questions in the past about the income tax reserve, and I didn't know whether any of that had changed from how, in terms of how the state does it, or any way that we interact with that, if there was anything that we should be concerned about in any of those figures.
I would say not. The biggest receivables are related to the construction of the community center. That's the money from the program Open Space, Natural Resources, and the Department of General Services State Bond. And the income tax reserve has been about $400,000 or so every year for a while. And I don't think that's basically going to go anywhere. It's going to be held back.
Right.
An amount similar to this every year. So the offset to that will be a deferred revenue account. And some of the Montgomery County is basically grants that for the fourth quarter of fiscal 10 that we had filed for reimbursement that we had not received. And also the highway user tax we didn't get until after the year ended.
Okay. So it's normal deferrals, normal amounts that are always out there.
Right. And also the federal government is related to the community center.
Right.
Auditorium.
Right. So those are all just in the pipeline, happening the way they're expected to, and they'll all be accounted for.
Yeah, basically.
Or carry through into the next year.
We've collected all this money except for the a little bit of the federal government, and I think it's about, what, $190,000? And the income tax reserve we didn't collect.
Right.
But as far as the grants, there was only one grant, I guess about $5,000 that has not been collected as of now.
Okay. Good. My second question is on page 77, and that's the net assets by component for the last 8 years. And I just wanted to, I had a question that may or may not get at something that I was wondering, but when we look at the invested in capital assets net of related debt, the first line on that one, and I couldn't help but notice that it stayed pretty much the same the last 4 years. There were jumps before that, and it started out way lower. Is that because there were changes in the standards in terms of what gets included, or does that really reflect investment in capital assets?
We have the construction of the communities center auditorium.
Right.
We had the green roof.
Right.
We had the Linden Avenue project.
Right.
We had a lot of.
But I'm looking back at 2003, and it was $2 million, and then it very rapidly jumped to $17 million, and it's kind of stayed constant and gone up.
Okay. I think what happened was the infrastructure had to be recorded.
That's what I was thinking it was that it had to come onto the books where it hadn't before.
Yeah, in 34, you went to more of a full accrual, more.
Right, okay.
Yeah, we had
That's what I thought it was, I just wanted to make sure.
We had to put the roads, bridges,
Right,
and things that
right.
weren't normally capturing as fixed assets on the
Okay.
books. So, yeah, that's the big jump between 2006 and 2007.
That's what I thought. Final one on page 91. I noticed that the last employer listed there had Silver Pearl and Sigmund and T-Lev at 80 employees in fiscal 2001, and I thought, mistake. They never had 80 employees. That must have been 8.
This information came from Dun & Bradstreet.
Well, that's crazy.
Those are the experts.
So I just wanted to point that out. And those are the only questions I had. Anybody else? Councilmember Snipper.
It could easily be in here and I missed it. I did try to read the whole thing. It's fairly dense going. and other council members have asked some of the questions that I had, but I was looking for one figure in there. Something that's concerned me a bit is trying to get a handle on, I'll call it the size of the rainy day fund. It's been something of continuing interest. And I wondered if you had somewhere in here you could point me to a particularly historical chart would be nice, where I could look at something like that.
So you think that unrestricted fund balance?
Yeah.
Or the emergency reserve is as close as we got to a rainy
Well,
day
the
fund.
unrestricted fund balance is probably bigger and better.
There's anything in MD&A that shows all those. This is general fund, undesignated, for that number? That's,
But if you want historical.
This is a rainy day.
Is that
Oh,
on the bottom,
whatever.
page 28? Unrestricted assets.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
yeah, that's going to be, that's full accrual.
Or is it page 79?
We're trying to get the right schedule. This is full accrual.
He wanted historical. So we kind of have to go through the stat tables.
Is it page 79?
I think 79, fund balance, because the net assets is going to be your full accrual, and that's really, that's throwing in a lot of your fixed assets and things, but this is going to be, for your budgeting and things like that, it's going to be,
Yeah, page 79.
we're going to go down, I guess, to reserved, unreserved, and some of it's for specific purposes. Certain amounts of storm management fund has an amount that's required to be used community center fund. So looking down at what's left.
Is that the 6.9 million under the general
Yes,
fund
that's
reserve?
going to be your unreserved. But of that, if you look at page 79, you almost have to match it back to page 30 because the requirements are a little different, and I do apologize for the way they flow. But page 30 also shows what you had designated for subsequent years' expenditures, which I don't think shows up on page 79.
No.
Yeah, so other reserved, for the designated for subsequent years' expenditures, that should be basically spoken for through encumbrances and then maybe a reallocation to the budget. So if you're looking for whatever is left at the end of the year undesignated that's not spoken for lack of a better term, by management, the 3.5 number on page 30 will show that number, but really to get it historically, we probably have to go back and pull that out for you to show that, because it's for the statistical tables, there are certain requirements that the standard setters have laid out as kind of a best practice, and this format is what they show. They really don't show it with that other undesignated piece broken out for the general fund.
So let me see if I understood what you said, which is that roughly the 3.4 million.
3.5.
I would say through the 3.5, a little further down on page 30.
Oh, the total undesignated general fund, I see. Okay, 3.5. And you would do that for all the other years as well?
Yes.
If you were to try to get historical. Thank you.
Sure.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Okay. We're moving to our first special session item, which is resolution recognizing American Indian Heritage Month in November and American Indian Heritage Day, November 26th. Councilmember Siemens, would you like to introduce this?
I'd like to move it, please.
Is there a second?
Second.
Seconded by Councilmember Clay. Discussion, Councilmember Siemens?
Thank you, Mayor. I just think that the American Heritage Day is an important way of recognizing the great importance of American Indians and other Native Americans and their contribution to society. Governor O'Malley signed a bill creating Friday after Thanksgiving as a state holiday titled American Indian Heritage Day, and I think it's appropriate for the city of Tacoma Park to recognize both that day and the month of November as American Indian Heritage Month. Thank you.
Councilmember Reynolds.
Well, I support this, but I'd also like to add that the We Are Tacoma series has its first cultural outreach event, a Basque cultural event, and my birthday's in November, so I think we should maybe include the Basque culture as part of this. Just kidding.
Anybody else? Any public comment on this resolution? Seeing none, all those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Any opposed? Okay, and we now have a resolution adopting the Tacoma Park Emergency Operations Plan and authorizing city manager to sign an emergency management memorandum of understanding with Montgomery County. And Captain Ed Corsi is here to talk about this, and also Dr. Wolfgang Merger. Welcome.
Presentation on your screens?
Yes. Yes, and I should mention that you are the, I was thinking co-chairs, but...
I am the co-chair.
Okay.
I think it's right. Thank you for making time for us this evening to talk about the Emergency Operations Plan. We call it the 2010 Emergency Plan as opposed to 2004. And it is totally redesigned, and we've asked you to adopt it, this document. And in order to make you aware of the high points, we made a slide presentation to go over the issues which are touched on by this plan. First, you have before you what's called the basic plan. The basic plan has the emergency roles, the declaration, the concept of operation, and hazard mitigation. What you don't have before you is the functional annexes, the support annexes, and the internet-specific annexes, which exist but have to be refined, and we'll have to present them piece by piece after we clarify certain issues.
The basic plan that you see before you was written by members of Dewberry, which was a firm that was contracted by Montgomery County to do their emergency operations plan. There was some funding that was made available to the municipalities about 2 years ago to start to contribute to make plans that would dovetail into that. We've got several steps that are in place for the approval of this plan. One was that we put the plan before the Emergency Preparedness Committee. They formed a subcommittee to review it, have made some suggestions for some alterations which are included in what you see before you now. We're asking that the City Council adopt the basic plan here, and then there will be ongoing coordination with Montgomery County to make sure that our plan does not conflict in any way with theirs, which we hope to achieve by using the Dewberry firm to create the plan to begin with. There are also special items, like Dr. Merger mentioned, the various annexes that we will be going through in the coming year. We'll be working with staff and hopefully with council input as well to make sure that they meet the needs of the city. And on a yearly basis, the city manager and the emergency management coordinator will be reviewing the plan to make sure that it's current and up to date. The various risks that the plan is designed to address, it's designed to be an all-hazards plan, which means that pretty much any activity that you'd undertake under the plan should fit in some way, shape, or form in a variety of types of emergencies. But the most common emergencies that we might face here in Tacoma Park, which you might want to know is a very kind of hazard-free part of the country to live in. We don't have a whole lot of major emergencies in this part of the country. But the ones that we do have are severe thunderstorms, like some of the ones that we experienced over the summer. A tornado scenario certainly presents probably the most likely significant emergency event that we would have here. Snow events. It was a warm summer, but we all do remember February and December, so snow events can be a big issue here. Hurricanes have been known to affect this part of the country. Being this close to the nation's capital, of course, we have to be concerned about things like terrorist events, potentially, although the risk for that is small in Tacoma Park. We do have railroad tracks. Potential for a train derailment is there, although it's not very much, not very much of the CSX line that's in the city of Tacoma Park. And then, of course, the potential for something like a plane crash always exists. There were a number of assumptions that the plan laid out, the largest of which is that in emergency management, the fire departments tend to manage most of the different types of emergencies that you can envision. And, of course, the city of Tacoma Park does not have its own fire department. Fire service here is provided by the Montgomery County Department of Fire Rescue Services. So in most events, the lead agency that will take command of the incident is going to be the fire department, which is a county agency. But also many of the events that you can foresee that we talked about in the slide before likely will cover parts of the city as well as parts of the county. So in any respect, the county will likely be in charge of the event. City resources are present, of course, police department, public works department, various other city departments, but may work under the overall direction of the county during an emergency. And, of course, the plan, one of the goals of using Dewberry was to make sure that the plan was NIMS compliant and that it contained provisions for using the incident command system, which is a kind of universal command model used to describe how we would manage any major event.
An emergency has to be declared. There are two types of declarations of emergency. One is non-declared disaster, so many incidents are handled on a local basis, and the other one is declared disaster. You remember that?
Yeah.
A non-declared disaster is a disaster where we think the local resources are sufficient to handle it, close off streets and so on, and there's no reimbursement cost expected, but it may activate the Emergency Operations Center. Okay? This is tornadoes are a common threat. More and more warnings have issued this year. The general emergencies are either local declarations, which relate to the city, state declarations, which the state declares an emergency, or the federal government. The local is declared by the city manager, or it can be declared by the county executive. The severity of the emergency warrants a coordinated response and the management of resource shortages and the activation of the emergency operations plan. The city council, at the end of such an emergency response, has the right to declare determination. As you notice, the pictures go more and more up in severity, a little bit more severe. The state of emergency by the state is declared by the governor. The emergency either exists or is impending. Is declared by executive order or by proclamation, and assistance made available to local jurisdictions. The federal emergency, the governor requests disaster declaration from the president. This disaster declaration puts into motion long-term federal recovery program to victims, businesses, and public entities. Less severe is the emergency declaration, which is more limited and designed to focus on specific needs. See our third members here. The declaration process The local emergency is declared by the city manager, who will consult with the Office of Emergency Management and Homeland Security. This office is responsible for monitoring the event. Montgomery County will notify the Maryland Emergency Management Agency, MEMA, and a local emergency must be declared before state and federal assistance can be requested.
Before we jump on, just to refresh, we were discussing this afternoon that in the case of the snow events, for instance, though, it wasn't this process where you started out with a local declaration at the local level. There was pretty much the first declaration was the governor stating that there was a state of emergency at the state, and that allows the state resources to be used at a local level.
The concept of operations. The City of Tacoma Park has responsibility to protect lives and property and to assist in recovering from an emergency. The city will supplement its emergency resources with private organizations and with volunteer efforts. If the capability within the city exceed the assistance, will be requested from Montgomery County.
When there's one of these events that occurs, the initial command, and actually the command throughout the response, is going to be handled by what's called an on-scene commander, an incident commander. And there are procedures in place outside of this plan that designate who that would be. And as I said earlier, in most cases it's going to be an incident commander from the Department of Fire and Rescue Services. And departments like the police department would provide a supporting role. But there are some incidents that could evolve as a City of Tacoma Park emergency, either a police incident occurring within the City of Tacoma Park, or perhaps a public works type of emergency, where you'd have an on-scene commander who is a city representative. The responsibilities of the on-scene commander are they establish their command, they set up a command post, establish staging areas. There's a lot of other things that go into that initial setup of the arrangement that I didn't go into here, but predominantly they're going to notify other agencies, and most emergencies we're talking about are the types of events that are handled by more than one agency. So it would be more than just the police department, for instance, handling this event. You bring representatives of the various agencies into the command post so that the incident commander has it there, at their fingertips, the resources they need to figure out what needs to happen to address that emergency. And they do that by developing what's called an incident action plan. All this terminology is standard terminology used in the National Incident Management System and the National Response Framework. They develop this incident action plan, and then they implement the plan over a variety of periods of time. And then they continually assess and reevaluate, and that can work in a cyclical manner. So that's what happens in the on-scene command of an incident. And all incidents essentially begin as a local response and are commanded at a local level by the incident commander. These are some of the other duties that might fall under the incident commander's purview: making the arrangements to distribute warnings to portions of the civilian population, conducting evacuations, providing for displaced or injured persons, conducting damage assessments, and so forth and so on. This is a model that shows what incident command looks like. There are basically four basic functions that the incident commander has to be responsible for. Most of handling the issue is going to be in the operations section. They're going to have a planning section that's going to help them develop that incident action plan. Logistics that are going to help bring in different resources, keep track of those resources, and then finance and administration, which is going to keep track of the costs of all of this. Now we're going to talk about some of the roles of different members of government in the emergency operations plan. One, obviously, the most important role is the city manager's role. They're authorized to declare local states of emergency, although, as we saw in the snowstorm, for instance, it's not necessary that a local state of emergency be declared unless you're seeking to trigger some sort of powers. They're also responsible to direct emergency operations, and they're authorizing resource commitments. So, for instance, the city manager would authorize sending city resources to areas outside of the city, for instance, in support of another emergency. The plan provides for an emergency management coordinator, and this is a support role Its most important role is probably in providing some pre-emergency planning assistance. Maintaining this plan, for instance, would be a responsibility of the Emergency Management Coordinator. Providing support for mobilizing the Tacoma Park Emergency Operations Center might fall under this person's purview. Maintaining what we call situational awareness for the Tacoma Park EOC staff. So providing the first set of information to the city staff, to the city manager, in order to justify the opening of the Tacoma Park EOC. And then providing a constant liaison with the Montgomery County EOC, which serves a similar role for the county.
So who is the EMC?
I guess I'm going to be the EMC, I guess.
I hope that's well-defined, and you know that before.
I know, I know it, I didn't know it was decided yet. Okay. And these are the roles of the various city department directors. They're going to continue to manage their specific departments. They're going to keep the city manager appraised of the activities of those departments, keep the city manager informed of situational awareness. They're going to provide or arrange resources requested by the incident commander, so the EOC serves as a solid resource for the incident commander. Rather than telling the incident commander what needs to happen, the incident commander determines that, and the EOC supports them to make sure that that happens. They're going to assist with long-term planning and resource availability. So a lot of these emergencies, sometimes you'll get into multiple operational phases. You can't throw everything you have at once at the emergency, because then you might not have anything left 24 hours later. So a lot of the long-term planning needs to occur at an EOC. And they may have to assist with other roles. The city manager may have to assign department heads certain roles that they may not be initially think is in their purview. So the rec department may have to serve a different function than providing recreational services throughout an emergency. Again, the TPEOC is going to coordinate resources, set priorities, help with damage assessment, and provide information to the community. These are the people who might attend the Tacoma Park Emergency Operations Center. Of course, the city manager or designee will be there, the emergency management coordinator. Most importantly, they will have a communications officer. This will be a person responsible for pushing out information to the public. Police chief will be there, public works director, finance director, and support staff as necessary.
Where is that located?
It's not so much important about where you locate it, it's the function that it serves. And what it is it's a coming together of the department directors, whether it be in a conference room here. If this building was perhaps compromised, it could be at a conference room somewhere else. It could be a virtual meeting of those people. The important thing is a synergy between the department heads, so that things don't fall through the cracks, and that the response doesn't rely on any one person's expertise, but the expertise of the whole. So that's the concept of emergency management. Okay, so talk about the people.
Do you want to hold questions at the end, Bruce, or how do you want to?
We're almost at the end,
Yeah.
but
Okay.
the other things provided in the plan, and that we also need to work on some of the annexes, are ongoing training and exercises in the plan. So we have done a fairly good amount of incident command type training throughout the city government. It's been a couple of years, but we have done it. And we need to do some training that intermingles our operations with the county operations, because pretty much any of these emergencies that we're going to be faced with, we're going to be working with the county. Whether the city is in the dominant role or whether the county is in the dominant role, we'll be working together with them. So all of our training needs to take that into account. The county does provide training and a variety of exercises throughout the year. We've participated in a number of those over the years, both tabletop and field exercises as well. And then lastly, talking about annexes to the EOP, there's a variety of annexes. Some are functional. They talk about things like communications. Some might be incident-specific, like we might have an annex on weapons of mass destruction events, for instance, because there might be certain aspects of that type of emergency that we need to have special information about. And that was our presentation. Zip through it
Thank
pretty
you.
quickly, but
Thank you.
I'm sure we have some questions.
Yeah, some questions. First, I just want to say that I'm quite comfortable with this whole structure and presentation. It's something I've become very familiar with my 8-9 years now of being a member of the National Capital Region Emergency Preparedness Council. This is the kind of stuff, it's the same acronyms, it's the same system that I see 6 or 7 times a year on a regional level. I'm glad to see that this was put together with help from a UASI grant, since those grants come through the state agents, and the original source of the recommendations for what this region applies for in the way of funding comes from the Chief Administrative Officers Committee at COG and gets kind of, I won't say approved, but run through the EPC, so that seeing that we're benefiting from some UASI grant in this way is heartening. And I've got some specific questions, but I just wanted to lead it off by saying I'm very familiar with this, and I'm imagining Councilmember Clay is very familiar with a lot of this as well. And I know that we have other residents of the city who are very familiar with this. There are 1 or 2 folks who live in town who are part of the Maryland Emergency Management System and the Federal Emergency Management System, who I see at these meetings all the time, so that we do have other resources to call on as well. And I think this plan makes a lot of sense. So questions, first, Councilmember Clay.
I actually don't have a lot of questions, a couple comments. One of them is I would suggest that you include the council in your training and exercises, so that the council learns how to deal with the media issues in emergency preparedness, and we don't have an Alexander Haig moment. That was the guy who stood up and said, "I'm in charge," right?
Yes.
Yeah.
I was like a sophomore in high school then, but I remember that. So that's one suggestion. The other thing is, it seems like you should designate who the, I forget what the exact title was, but the emergency commander was the title that we talked about first, that we didn't have a designated person.
The emergency
Operations.
emergency management coordinator?
Emergency management coordinator. So
Yeah.
I think that should be a designated position, actually stated as a designated position, or specifically stated that it's appointed by the city manager for each individual disaster and or incident. And the other one is, it also seems like you should...
Are you talking about emergency management coordinator or the incident commander?
Well, the incident commander, I assume, is appointed by the city manager if we had one for our city, but isn't that a county operation?
The incident commander evolves through policies that are already in place, but it could be a fire and rescue person. It could be a
Right,
police
based on
person.
what the activity is, right?
So you are talking about the emergency manager.
Emergency manager. And then the other comment is, we should probably also have a designated place for our operations center if we were to set one up, assuming that that would be here, and assuming that this building was standing. I think in almost all instances, this is where it would be, and it's good to know where it's going to be so that you could have extra phone capacity or computer capacity and have a plan for setting it up. Those are my only comments. Other than that, it looks very nice, and I can tell you guys have been doing a lot of work and sort of getting immersed in the culture of it, which is so much about what the emergency management is about, is immersing yourself in the culture and predefined relationships and plans.
We had in the 2004 version of the plan, we had envisioned, and that was about the time this renovation to the building was in full swing. We pretty much envisioned that the conference room down in the police station, closest to the chief's office, would be the location that we would most likely use as the EOC. Now, there was no money set aside to provide additional phones or additional computer hookups. It is possible to hook up computers in the room, and there are phones in the room. But developing a center like Montgomery County Center is quite costly, but
Yeah, I don't think
but
we
the
would
point
have
is,
anything
the
very
point
big
is valid.
scale.
The idea needs to be established, but that's the location that we envisioned.
Okay.
Let me answer too. Number one, the point you made to involve the council tonight is the first time we do that, and we intend to do it more.
Yeah, I think we need specific training.
I'm with you.
Yeah, I was going to make the same point and say that if there's any particular training or tabletop, it would be good to invite the council. I know I've taken part in various tabletops on a regional level, and at times I've been the designated representative of the board of directors, and I go act as the liaison to the EOC, and kind of then have to bring my report back to the board and brief the board on the whole thing. And one other quick point I wanted to interject about your point about setting up an EOC. My understanding as we started to get back into this room was that there was also potential capability here in this room, if needed, to link to either to have something here or to link it to something else in this building or elsewhere, so that this, if there were more room needed, that this room has capabilities.
And the question about the EMC, my understanding was that the city administrator has made a determination to make Captain Kersey to be the EMC.
Councilmember Robinson.
Thank you. I'm feeling educated and on board and appreciate the depth and insights that are in this document. And I appreciated the specific types of emergencies that you put together as examples. And I heard you mention the train tracks going through town. Now, I remember some years ago there was concern that there were dangerous chemicals and other things in some trains going through our nation's capital, and I don't know if those go along these tracks or if they go in other tracks. Do they go in these tracks? And I'm glad to see that you understand, or that you are aware of those chemicals, and I'm assuming that plays into the specifics of what kinds of emergencies might occur. And since I don't know exactly what they are or how they might be misused or mishandled, or I can only assume that there's a potential for an emergency there, and it might be a fast emergency, and which leads me to a kind of a second concern. And what if it's a slow emergency? What if there's a leak that can't be stopped, or something that spreads out over days and weeks, and there could certainly be panic in that sort of situation, or misunderstanding. And I haven't read the whole document, but I'm also hoping that there's a sense that you could have a slow emergency as opposed to a fast emergency. Am I right in thinking that you've anticipated that kind of thing?
Certainly some of the tabletops that I've participated in over the last couple of years, some of them have dealt with a train derailment scenario, which would be a rapidly unfolding event. One of the advantages we have, we don't have any train yards here where the train cars would be sitting for large periods of time, and really don't have any switching facilities. It's just pretty much straight track line. So the odds of an event are probably pretty low, but a slowly unfolding event has been a topic of discussion, particularly when you talk about WMD events, weapons of mass destruction events. The dirty bomb is the scenario that many people are discussing, and how something like that would unfold is generally not really well thought out, except that it probably wouldn't be immediately noticeable. So the agencies that would bring that type of information to our attention, probably public health agencies, again, predominantly a county agency for us. So we would hear about that likely from the county, who would be tapped into monitoring EMS information and hospital information, and they would piece that together through people becoming sick and showing up at different places. and matching of the symptoms.
In this document, you see a great detail spent on informing the public. How is it done? What means exist to inform the public? And I think this would be one of the major concerns, to have reliable information going out, to avoid a panic, and to have people connected with our operations center to get information from us. The TP alert is one means, reverse 911 is already explained in the document. And that's, I think, essential for getting a coordinated response.
Thank you.
And let me just add one quick thing on your question about the slowly unfolding event. There was a whole session, a day-long session last Monday that I was supposed to attend the afternoon part of, but I didn't since things were unfolding here, and I devoted my energies to here. It was an interesting one where the scenario was that there were some bombs that showed up in Atlanta, and then a day later, 3 in Baltimore. And how do you react when something gets there, and they make calls for aid, and everybody, the first sense is, oh, we'll send all the aid we can, but then do you send it or do you hold stuff in reserve because it may move here next? So as things start to come in, there's all of those scenarios of how do you not get trapped into responding to everything as an immediate short-term thing, but how do you hold your reserves? It was kind of almost a sense of war games.
You get that feeling very much when you sit through some of these tabletop exercises.
It kind of is.
You hope that stuff never happens, but the purpose of the exercise is that you would know how to react if it does.
Councilmember Wright.
Definitely want to echo the idea of involving the mayor and council members in this. I think the snow event and emergency last year is sort of a good example of this, that de facto we often become a hub of communication, or we get information. Residents look to us or contact us because they have our cell phone number or our email, but they may not have the MC's email. So trying to figure out how to integrate that in. Another thing that just I wasn't sure how to clarify, or if it's clarified in here, it is sort of the Alexander Haig issue, in that, who's in command. Obviously the city manager is the ultimate decision maker, but and this is not a knock on your location of where you live, but there are situations where we might not be able to get hold of Barb in an emergency because she doesn't live where Daryl lives, for example, where you could go knock on her door if you had to with a cruiser. So is there some way to know in here, if Barb's not available, who's the next, and so on and so forth? Because the logical rules of the assistant city manager, for example, might not be the best person to make decisions in an emergency.
Well, and again, that's why I talk about the synergy of the group within the TPEOC that's important to managing the event, because it's not one single person's expertise that you rely on, but also you have to have someone's authority. So everything we do pretty much is going to be under the authority of the city manager. If the city manager, for whatever reason, was unavailable, there are succession plans for that. The assistant city manager would be the first person in succession, and they would have to be and are capable of performing her duties. It would be unfortunate if she was not available, but unimaginable almost, because she's very, very easily accessible.
No, it wouldn't be because of anything. That it would be because there was some telecommunication problem where he couldn't reach Barb.
Exactly.
So, for example, the city manager is the next, the assistant city manager is the next decision maker, as opposed to the chief of police, for example.
Yes.
And how is that decision determined? How do you determine that?
I think maybe the city manager wants to say something.
We have that specifically laid out in a Cooper plan, but
I was just going to say, we went through a training exercise about a year ago in the city of Gaithersburg in conjunction with Gaithersburg officials, and one of the actual tabletop exercises for both the Gaithersburg city manager and myself was that both of us were responding to emergencies in our respective communities. I was in a car accident, was basically comatose, I think, for 2 weeks, and that was basically the scenario that played out, is how did the line of succession play out when not only was I unreachable, but I was comatose and not able to speak. And I know one of the things the evaluator said is, compared to Gaithersburg and our organization, there was no doubt in terms of the line of succession, that was very clear to the staff that was present.
Next question is, I assume in Section 4, the independent specific annexes, that's where you have information about specific scenarios, so like the idea of a train derailment of, I don't know, Wolfgang, you told me, I think, the second week I was on the council, there's some chemical, right, that there was a chlorine gas derailment, it would like basically flood the Penn neighborhood with a toxic gas, right? So is that where this kind of information, what our plan of action would be in an event of these different?
Yes.
Obviously, you can't predict everything, but maybe there's some unlikely but foreseeable potential possibilities.
It used to be fashionable in emergency operation plans to have an annex for every possible event. And you found the list of annexes going past 26, so you're going, Annex Z, then Annex AA, B, double B, so forth. More recent schools of thought have tried to get these plans to be all hazard plans, so that you're pretty much doing the same functions that you would for a hurricane as you would for a hazardous materials event, and you're putting labels on those activities as far as what the function is. So they use an emergency support function role, and there's about 15 of these emergency support functions. And then the city of Tacoma Park, of course, doesn't have departments that would handle all 15 of these, but we handle a variety of them. So we have a number of draft annexes for support functions that the city would provide, and then a few annexes where we're going to say that we're going to defer to the county for that service. But there are also a handful of scenarios where we might have an incident-specific annex. So we'll probably have about a dozen annexes when we're finished, say, the next year's worth of planning.
And then just to clarify, in some areas it's like very clear who has primary responsibility for a service or a function between the county and the city, right? So like the schools is the county and the police department is the city. It's a little bit harder with something like this, right? Where we can't always say it's the county's responsibility, but for example, you take the winter storm, the city doesn't have responsibility for providing emergency shelters, for example. Really, that's a county function. Is there any way to delineate that sort of stuff, and how does the rebating of services play into that function, or is it just too confusing to lay out?
I think on certain functions, such as firefighting, hazardous materials, handling hazardous materials incidents, for instance, it's obvious that the Department of Fire and Rescue Services, which is a county agency, will have to take the lead on that. And we don't even have an annex that would deal with those issues. We might have an annex that would deal with mass care and sheltering, in which case we would refer to the county. And it's not necessarily that the county has to do those functions, it's that the county is prepared to do those functions. And the city doesn't have a department that would coordinate those efforts.
The shelter works as follows. The county requests of the Red Cross to open a shelter, and the Red Cross is the primary agency who manages a shelter with security and supplies and everything.
Yeah, and in fact, it's a multi-organizational effort to run a shelter. It's not only Red Cross, it's Department of Health and Human Services provides staffing for it as well. Sheriff's Department provides security for it. So there's a robust plan in place at the county level to operate shelters, and they have a robust capability as well to do that. The city just simply does not have those resources to conduct that type of operation.
Right. So I just want to say, thank you. I'm very supportive of this, and thank you to Wolfgang for all of your efforts on emergency preparedness. and to the whole committee, but I know that without your leadership, we wouldn't be as far along in our preparedness as we are, so I appreciate that.
Thank you. Councilmember Siemens?
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you both for being here tonight and for your work and also the work of the entire committee on developing.
There are some of them here, too.
Some of them here tonight. Developing this plan and refining the plan. Several months ago, I took a course in emergency management for community leaders, and I think that defined a role for elected officials, including council members in the city. That is a component, as several people on this council have pointed out tonight, is missing from the plan. There is a role for elected officials, an important role that I think should be included in the plan. And then the training, I think that training was put on by the Federal Emergency Management Agency in conjunction with the National League of Cities. And it was a couple days, and it was, I think, very comprehensive and would be something that maybe we could consider, if not bringing here for the city council, bringing here for some of the local elected officials, and maybe we could host that. Anyways, again, I appreciate this refinement of the plan. I mean, I think we really started to pay serious attention to emergency planning back at the turn of the century, with the anticipated, if maybe a little reactionary, emergencies disasters that might happen surrounding the year 2000 computer changes. But it became, much more focused on September 11th of 2001 with that disaster. And I guess I'm glad to see that we have refined the plan, but I'd like to see the city doing more in actually preparing operationally for the local piece of this. And I know you do some tests at the county level, where you actually do some role plays and things such as the city manager talked about. But I would like to see us do some things at the local level, because I think there are many local events that incidents that could happen that we want to be prepared for. And I also think there are some things that happen in the city now that if we were a little better practiced, we could deal with in a better way. And I'll give you an example, and I don't use it I don't intend to embarrass anybody with the example, but I think it's a real-world example that's very pertinent to the discussion. A couple of weeks ago, we had a very localized power outage on Maple Avenue that affected a couple of the high-rise apartment buildings. It ended up focusing on one of the apartment buildings for a couple of days. They were without power in part of their building. And the part of the building that were out of power in was hallways and elevators, included those. Unfortunately, during those days, the residents in the building were pretty much on their own. It was, some of them, I guess, called the police dispatcher with concerns and asking for help. I know they called Pepco, and Pepco came and was working on it, but it still took them a couple of days to get it fixed. But yet, like 24 hours later, the housing department didn't know there was a problem. And the residents in the building were left to fend for themselves, and they had no power. Now, many of them could do that on their own, but there are elderly and disabled that live in the building. They had to face, those on the upper floors had to face the challenge of, if I go out and go down 7 flights of stairs, or 8 or 9 or 10, I think it's an 11-story building, that then I've got to go up 11 flights of stairs into total darkness. And I think we talk about each of us as residents preparing for emergencies, and maybe some of those who were better prepared in their own apartments could, fared better than those that weren't prepared. But yet, I think as a city government, that we have a responsibility to check on people and to also ensure that the proper people are informed, so that they can make sure that, if there are no lights in the building, that the building owner is advised of his responsibilities, providing lighting in the hallways and the stairways. And like I say, that's an important, a separate issue, but it's, I think, a good example of kind of a test of how well are we doing, and the plan is great, and this obviously addresses things at a much bigger level than a power outage in one building. But I think that as we practice on some role playing within the city and just with our staff in the city, that we would get better at things, and as we think in these same emergency preparedness or these disaster recovery, we think in that vein that we would do better at serving the community in these smaller emergencies that we have. And my point is that when we get better at those, we're going to be a whole lot better when the big thing happens. It isn't enough just to prepare for the big thing, because we have a whole lot of opportunities to practice, so that when the big one comes, we can say, oh yeah, we know how to handle people in the apartment building when the power's out.
Councilmember Siemens, you expressed concern about something. I'm concerned, and we are planning to do some initiatives in this direction. We have 60% of the cities are apartment buildings, high-rise apartment buildings, and our contact with them to make safety precautions is very limited. We have been invited twice to these buildings, but there should be more planning and the action with them. Thank you.
And I would say, Captain Corsi made a comment earlier in respect to shelters, that the city doesn't have the resources. And I know that what he meant is that the city council has not allocated resources to do something like that. I think that whether or not the council would do that for shelters is one thing, but I think that Mr. Mergner points out something that needs to be done, and maybe it's something where the city council needs to provide some resources so that we can better prepare the residents of the city.
I think I found out about the scenario that you're discussing well after the event, actually from the email I got from Jesse, as a matter of fact. But it did highlight, just like managing an emergency doesn't involve coming up with any one right answer. It's not, you're not relying on one person's expertise to get it done. Finding out about that highlighted one thing that I know that we have as an action item in the police department. You learn from these type of events how to handle it. And I think that 3 or 4 years ago, really people were taking power for granted, pretty much. It was very rare that it went out for very long, but we're starting to see scenarios develop where it goes out for sometimes days in certain areas. So it's becoming more of an issue to us, and I think staff is becoming more sensitive to those type of issues. Maybe not in this particular case, but again, we would like to have been on top of something like that.
And I think, as you said, that I don't think anybody expects everything to be done right anytime. Right. But if we can, it's good to have some feeling of assurance that we're going to learn from those mistakes and do better at it the next time. And that's why I think it's important to kind of think of how that fits into the bigger picture, because when the real disaster comes, if it does, if we've gotten to where we can do the little ones pretty well, it's going to be a whole lot easier to handle a bigger one.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Snipper.
Thank you, Mayor. I do want to thank both of you very much for this report. I think it's really an excellent framework, and I applaud that you tried to approach it from a framework view rather than getting into the weeds which would of necessity require a lot of updating and so on. It's better to have the bigger picture. I really applaud that. My own observation in some recent incidents is that communications are key. And I mean not only the physical technology of communications so that responders can talk to each other, but I'm talking about communications to the council, to the public at large, to utilities, to, depending on the emergency, key businesses such as grocery stores, and community groups. I think we need to devote a little bit more planning into how those communication pathways and linkages will be used and set up and maintained, a little bit of preparation and practice doing it. In our recent Snowmageddon, as several council members have commented, that there were some issues with communications. And residents need to know, for example, that a grocery store is closed or not, for example. If they trudge through the snow for blocks and blocks only to find it closed, that's a really kind of silly sort of thing to do. I also agree with some of the comments. I want to elaborate a little bit on some of the comments about local or slow emergencies. I think that we have a much higher likelihood of things like a water main breaks, plural, happening, especially in winter, where you'd get a lot of frozen water all over the place that could end up closing major roads for long periods of time until that's cleared up. Power outages, as we were just discussing, is particularly a problem in high-rise apartments, but lengthy power outages would be a problem for anyone. I think we need to prepare for those. If we had a natural gas main break, these are all way more likely than a plane crash in Tacoma Park, frankly. And there are things that would, as indicated, would help us prepare for these. I've often wondered if we had a truck fire on 410, where it partially destroyed the street, spilled enough gasoline to burn up part of the street. It could take a long time to clear away that and open 410 or some other major throughway. We already had a snow emergency, so we know what's that like, and we learned a lot of lessons from that. But given climate change, I suspect we should be prepared for heat waves as well. And they're a different kind of problem. It's not, you don't see the snow in the street when it's hot, but we need to prepare residents for what to do in such circumstances. So I urge a little bit of addition to this to address those issues, the communications and the more likely local emergencies. And the last thing I do want to reiterate is I think that the council needs to be included in the COOP planning process. If there were a long, I did read it.
This one here or the COOP? There are two plans.
There are two plans.
This one is emergency operations plan.
Right.
And COOP is maintaining operation if there's a major shortage of city workers.
Right. And I'm switching topics and talking about the COOP plan. Sorry, I wasn't more clear. But my only comment is I think it does need to involve the council in that longer-term continuity of operations part of it.
We certainly want to involve you in this one here. And as a matter of fact, I propose that the council takes FEMA 100 and 700 and knows how these things work.
Yeah.
And I would recommend strongly that you do that. And I would be willing, if you're interested, to set it up here so it can be done in a group. And you can, in a group, do the test together and get a certificate for it.
Thank you.
And I've just got a couple quick observations. The first one is, I just want to make sure that I read something that I'm assuming is incorrect, and that's on page 7 of the EOP. In the annexes, it lists Gaithersburg Police Department as primary agency twice, and I'm assuming that that's going to get corrected going to the final from the draft. And I saw a couple places in here where I was assuming there was a function for a PIO, and I'm assuming that would be the police department PIO.
We've had our PIO working with the, I guess it's the communications department anymore, or predominantly the new employee that they hired.
Okay.
So again, that's a function, and actually it kind of dovetails in with what you were saying, Mr. Snipper, that one of the annexes deals with communications in general, and it is an area that probably you could always have improvement upon. But our PIO will be working with the city communications department to make sure that they have robust capabilities there. It all starts with the formulation of a message, and then once you develop the message, you use whatever avenues you have to get the message out. And I think we're better set today than we were even a year ago in that capacity. And I think you would see a better response out of the city at that point.
Good. And I'll add my voice to those who are saying that it would be best to include the council in exercises and planning. It's good to see that in this, that we each get a copy of the final plan.
Yes.
And I will note that there is part of the plan concerning itself with emergency roles and responsibilities, and the first people listed are us. And so it gives us information on defining our roles. And so we just probably need a little bit of practice in practical implementation of those roles, assuming that we understand them. And I also just wanted to make one quick comment in reference to Councilmember Siemens' comment about whether the council has or hasn't appropriated money for things like provisioning shelters. I think it's also the question of what the priorities are for funding and what roles we need to take going forward. And my sense is that we probably haven't done it because it would be in many ways duplicative. I think we would need to have some discussion about a sense of how that it might not be duplicative and necessary. That's not necessarily a discussion we've had. I'm comfortable with relying on the county in coordination with other agencies led by the Red Cross doing shelters, but I think what it reminded me of was a comment by somebody recently about Tacoma Park saying we're duplicative but special, and I think that kind of defines in many ways how we think of ourselves. Maybe somebody else does it, but we can do it better, or we need to do it because there's a particular reason, and I think it falls into that area of a discussion that we would need to have among ourselves about, yes, it is duplicative, but how special are the needs?
And that was exactly my point, is if we wanted to, we could.
I agree. Thank you. So we need to vote on a resolution adopting this draft plan or this plan?
This plan, phase plan.
Second.
Okay. I'm assuming we've had our comments. Is there any public comment? Okay. The Daniels twins have weighed in. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, the ayes have it. We'll take a short break and come back for our last item. is here to introduce the item.
Robert Goldman, Marty Harris are here this evening from Montgomery Housing Partnership to present their request for a payment in lieu of taxes agreement with the city for property they are purchasing, 7667 Maple Avenue, known as you said, Parkview Towers. This is a 125-unit property, and they are expecting to close around December 15th, 2010. Their request is for a 10-year agreement with a 100% municipal tax abatement. The tenants were given notification of their opportunity to purchase the property on August 2nd. There was no express interest at that time. However, as it is part of our process to send out our community organizers to properties that are going through this kind of transition, they went out to the property, met with the tenants a couple of times, and the tenants decided they wanted to form a tenants association so that they could better communicate with the staff of Montgomery Housing Partnership. So they registered their association on October 14th. So I'd like to turn it over to Rob Goldman and Artie.
Good evening. As you know, I'm Rob Goldman with Montgomery Housing Partnership. We have a contract to, as Linda mentioned, but we have a contract to purchase Parkview Towers on Maple Avenue to provide affordable housing and really take advantage of, the sort of the down market when we can buy a property that's probably less expensive than it might have been a few years ago. We're seeking to purchase the property utilizing loans from Enterprise Loan Fund and from the state of Maryland, and would then be putting together the sort of longer-term renovation and permanent financing for the project. As you see in the sort of information we gave you, in order to sort of make this project work, a pilot would be needed. So that is what we're requesting. I'm sort of happy to answer any questions and maybe talk it through that way.
Okay. Councilmember Clay.
Hello.
Hello.
So this project has a lot more units in it than the last one.
Yes.
Costs about the same amount of money, though. And it's currently in private ownership. And it's not currently a low-income housing tax credit property. And the county assesses it at a little over $8 million, which is sort of less than what you're paying, but what ultimately you're going to have in it. A couple questions. Are you going to sell the tax credits?
Well, we don't have tax credits on it now. I mean, we wouldn't get the goal here right now is to acquire the building using just sort of, I guess what I'd say, more conventional financing. It's not very conventional, but basically getting a loan, a traditional acquisition loan, and then using state money to sort of fill the gap. But that's sort of an acquisition loan. We would then be putting together sort of the financing to do a much more substantial renovation, and more likely than not would be using tax credits to do that.
Okay. So what do you do with the money when you get the tax credits?
That the tax credits would be used to finance the renovations.
Okay. So right now you're going to buy it and you're going to put in the $600,000 in stopgap renovations,
right,
that are included with this loan, of which you're getting $6 million from the Enterprise Community Fund. And there's online there's $1.5 million from the neighbor, I forget what it's called, the NC group, with $15,000 for, it's like green energy assessment. Does that sound familiar?
We're getting about 6.8 from Enterprise, 1.25 from the state of Maryland through their BRAC Preservation Loan Fund.
Okay.
And then we have a solar note.
What's this group online then that shows NeighborWorks Capital? Will it list this project? Also, NC approved its first mini-perm loan of $1.5 million to Montgomery Housing Partnership of Silver Spring. The loan will be used to acquire the Parkview Towers Apartments in Tacoma, Maryland, 120-unit high-rise apartment building.
Yep.
This $6.9 million first mortgage is made as a participation loan with Enterprise Community Loan Fund in the lead, a national CDFI. NC will also offer a $15,000 green energy grant to assist in evaluating its options.
So my project managers explained it to me, and I apologize. So Enterprise is taking the lead on it. They've gone out to some other groups to act as provide participation.
So, and the $1.5 million from NC is part of the $6.9 million.
Yeah, so, and they haven't really told us all who behind it, so we've just, just to us, we're dealing with Enterprise, but it sounds like they've brought NCC into the mix.
Okay, and then you're going to get this $15,000 green energy grant to look at green energy, and then presumably if you got the tax, if you got the tax credits, then you'd use the tax credit to do
a much more substantial renovation.
Substantial
we'd be,
renovations.
Right.
So if you get the tax credits, you have to do 20% of the units at 50% affordability, or 40% at 60% affordability. Which one would you do?
That's a minimum.
Yeah.
We do far more. And
you do a mix?
What's that?
You do a mix?
We do a mix of incomes. I do far more than 40, but we also do some at 60, some traditionally we've done some at 60, and then some even at 30, and then we have some maybe at 50. The exact mix is, isn't necessarily determined right now, but we try to do a mix throughout, and then even have some at market, or what I would sort of call unrestricted, and some of that is dictated by what the incomes of the residents are. And so we find in most buildings that we acquire, and we don't want to displace anybody. So what we traditionally find is about anywhere between 10 and 20% tend to be over the 60% tax credit income. And so we sort of want to build that in so we don't have to displace anybody. And then from there, we try to have some mix of folks below 60%.
Okay. This is a much better project than the last one that you brought to us. Looks much more financially sound. It is a chunk of change for us. This is more than the total of yearly of what our existing commitments are. But thanks. I think this is a much better proposal.
Councilmember Snipper.
Oh, no. It's my same song and dance. I agree with Colleen. This is, in many ways, a better project because I think you're doing kind of closer to the minimum necessary to get this project going. I do find it hard to lay out that much money for the city to lay out that much money for the project. So I would be in favor of a lower pilot than the 100% for this property in order to save the city some money. And I will stop there.
Councilmember Robinson.
Hello.
Hello. How you doing?
Is the BRAC Preservation Loan Fund, is that base realignment and closing? Is that what the BRAC stands for?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so it's a pot of money that Maryland's put together?
Yeah, basically, yes. The state had applied to the MacArthur Foundation. They had a sort of RFP for states and localities to apply for money for preservation, and the state added the twist of BRAC, the need for sort of BRAC housing. It's somewhat of a stretch maybe that in Tacoma Park we got the need for BRAC funding, but the state's sort of To me, it's a preservation fund, and, there's how they tie it all together. I leave it to the state to figure out.
Okay. And the Enterprise Community Fund, is that, who manages that fund? That's the bulk of the funding that you're going for.
So that's what used to be called the Enterprise Foundation, group started by Mr. Rouse from Columbia, who sort of got inspired in his older years and wanted to do something about affordable housing, and created a sort of a national nonprofit to support groups around the country to do affordable housing. And they have a fund, and from the earlier discussion, a fund that, but also they're pointing some other capital from other groups that have similar types of funds to get to the amount that that's in here.
Okay, so instead of going to banks directly, more you're going to these funds that still have an interest rate attached to them, so you still have to pay back to that fund.
Yep.
And are they kind of revolving loan funds that are partly supported by government?
I'm not sure if it's supported by, to be honest with you, I don't know exactly where they get their money. My sense is that they're getting it from banks who are maybe just for CRA or Community Reinvestment Act purposes, or maybe loaning them the money at a much more favorable rate, lower interest rate, and so they can pull a fund together. We actually originally had gone, this is sort of what's the shift in the market, I guess, in some ways. We traditionally go to a bank for the first, and we actually had approached a bank for that, and then I would have gone to Enterprise or a fund like that as a second, and then maybe the state as a third. But because some of these funds got burned during the most recent sort of economic situations where they weren't, as a second, they weren't able to control the sort of disposition of problem properties, they now have a desire to be in the first and just put in more that would have covered the first and the second. So they said they prefer to be in the first position.
Interesting. Well, I get mostly those are my questions. The rest of my comments really it's more a question of what our policies are toward affordable housing, and we have a rent stabilization program. This is another kind of affordable housing initiative, and it strikes me as being, well, I wrote down a couple of little differences. It seems like these are Montgomery County priorities, not ours. I wrote that down, and I can't really back that up, but that's how it strikes me. And that this is a solution to the deferred maintenance that we have in town in some instances, and it may carry its own problems. Our rent stabilization seems to be a reduction of income for small business people, and in the MHP approach, it's more like an increase in income for investors, or it's more investment-based with large amounts of money. And in rent stabilization, it strikes me as kind of a top-down governmental control of small business to get our policy objectives in place. And in this case, it's more of a hands-off with little control on our part. But it's costly to taxpayers if we give these give away the property taxes, the potential property taxes. And finally, in rent stabilization, I just noted that there's kind of a generalized benefit to renters by spreading, and there's also a sense that people live where they want and they at a lower rent, even though they're not necessarily of low income. And in the approach that you're taking, people of lesser means live in a single building because they can take advantage of the lower rents that are provided by you. And the law, I have trouble supporting this because I don't understand the long-term consequences of these two approaches and how they fit in for us together. It was before my time that we had that I think the last discussion of rent stabilization took place here, and I'm certainly not suggesting we enter into that right now. But as I say, I have kind of more questions than answers. And the $50,000 a year, well, 10 of those kinds of buildings is $500,000, that's more than we spend for our entire housing department. So I have real trouble supporting this, although I understand your approach, and it's a creative approach, and I admire that. So once again, I'm not going to support the reduction of our tax base through 100% grant, or I don't support any reduction. Although, as I say, I admire the creative efforts that you're making to bring this property, which is in some distress, I can assume, to increase its level.
Councilmember Wright.
Just so I'm clear, are there going to be any income qualified units at this point, or will that not happen until refinancing would occur?
I don't believe they would have income restrictions at this moment in time.
But would you still have to abide by the rent stabilization rents?
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I apologize. With the state money, there will be some income.
What are those? What are they?
Okay, so I think maybe we need to get back to you, but I believe instead of being at the 60% level, they're at the 80% level.
80% level.
Yeah.
80% of median income in Montgomery County is very high. It's like $80,000.
I mean, our goal here, not only our mission and our goal ultimately is to, have the other sort of mix that we talked about. So we're not going to wouldn't be shifting to the 80% level. We'd be sort of keeping a mix of similar to what there is now. In other words, some unrestricted, probably in the 10 to 20% range, and then the vast majority would be in the 50 to 60 or 40 to 60% range, and then a few units would probably be below 30. And that's just the model we've used, and the financing that we'd be using longer term would sort of dictate some of that too.
So one of the things that strikes me a little bit odd about this project is it's what's happening with this project, because you don't have the other financing secured yet, is in essence similar to what happened with the project we just looked at, which is you bought something and really couldn't do a full-blown, high-quality renovation, and you had to come back to it later on. I guess you're doing that sooner, in theory, if you get this other financing you're looking at, but it does seem a little bit like you're undertaking a project against some lessons that you've learned, that it doesn't usually work that well to do it this way, basically to purchase and do the initial renovation and or the upgrades you put in to the level that would be really high quality. Maybe you do it differently because you're quite confident in the next 3 to 5 years you're going to do the more substantive renovation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the distinction is on the other property, we did that for a 15-year time period, and then, and here, with pretty much all the buildings we do, so that was one model, and I think the other model we talked about was really acquiring the building and doing the sort of upfront, more substantial renovation. And so for all those, we typically, because of the dynamics of the market in Montgomery County, and needing to buy and take advantage of opportunities, we sort of have to buy with acquisition financing, and we can't wait. The tax credit process and all those other sort of processes take much too long to be able to hold, to get a contract and get an owner to agree to that.
Mm-hmm.
So we really put in a situation of buying the property and then getting the other financing together. I think here it's maybe slightly, and that with a robust, economy with lots of sort of soft money and other things to fill it in, that could take 2 to 3 years just to go through that whole process. And so I think we're saying here is with a slightly, it could take that long, but with things the way they are, we're also going to prepare ourselves for a situation where it could take a little longer. And so that's why we said here 3 to 5 years. And it also gives us an opportunity, it gives us an opportunity really to stabilize the property. It's not performing well. There's ramifications for residents and other things, but also it has ramifications for the ultimate financing. And our hope is, for example, water bills and other things that are pretty high, that we can stabilize the property. We could get private financing to pay for the renovations because we've now created more value in the property. Right now, it's just very inefficient, and if we were to go to the market right now, we wouldn't be able to show the lenders that there's cash to support a certain size loan. But if we were to kind of create some better operations there and get the water bills in a better shape, we feel it could support more private debt and less other money.
And who are you buying this from? What's the company?
It's just Parkview Towers LLC.
But presumably it's a real estate who?
Well, somebody behind that, obviously.
Right.
The partner is Vincent England. He's owned the property since 87.
Okay. And were there other bidders on the property at the $6,795,000 number?
Yes.
And so what happens if we don't give you the pilot?
This is something where, we're trying to make it work. We'll continue to try to make it work. But, from the numbers we showed you, the folks who are putting the money up want to see, certain debt coverage ratios that we're not, without a pilot, we would not be able to achieve. So it effectively puts our ability to get that financing in jeopardy.
And so one scenario would be that you'd go back to the seller and say, we can offer you whatever the debt financing can support. Maybe it's 6.5, or maybe it's 6, and they would have to decide yes or no. Maybe they'll decide to sell it to someone else. Is that?
Yeah. If we can't do it, I guess the owner would, take his options and try it somewhere else.
Yeah. I'm very supportive of your work. I've been one of the council members who's been the most supportive related to pilots in the past. I just find it problematic or hard for us at this amount of money, close to $50,000 a year that we're being asked for to support that when we don't really have guarantees about what the income, the rent levels are going to be. You're not bound by any tax credits, which, you can give me your word, but you're not bound. The tax credit situation sets up a whole set of requirements for many years into the future that you meet certain median income, percents of median income guidelines for the tenants. And being uncertain about whether you're going to be able to get financing for the project to really improve it, it's hard for me to justify investing that amount of money, coupled with the vast number of other pilots we've given, and just thinking, we have to figure out where we would get $50,000 next year within the budget, and that's an employee here at the city, and we're struggling to do many important things for the city. So it's problematic. I just, at this point, I don't feel like I can support the request. I feel like there needs to be another way to make the acquisition part work, and I might be more supportive when you're coming back to actually do the renovation and have the guarantees around the number of units and what the median income levels would be. And just not sure that I can support it at this point based on what's on the table, what we're giving up, and kind of what we're getting.
Well, I don't think we have any objection if you want to put, restrictions on it. As long as it was reasonable and it our goal would be not to displace anyone, so as long as the goals didn't lead to any displacement, we don't have a problem. It's our mission to provide it as affordable housing, and if you wanted to, as a stipulation of the...
I mean, I think the nice thing about the tax credit structure is it sets up someone else doing the monitoring, and we don't really have the bandwidth to be certain that that's occurring. That's the nice thing when you join into another deal with the tax credit requirements. There's a whole set of incentives that that require that to occur. So.
Councilmember Siemens.
Thank you, Mayor. Just following along that same line, my understanding is what you're asking for is a pilot. You're not asking for relief from rent stabilization at this point.
Not at this point, no.
Which means that that you would still be required to meet the obligations or requirements of rent stabilization, including the rents that you charge for the units. It actually might be an interesting exercise to require some income verification. It would be a measure of rent stabilization program. Because I would argue that I hear often, sometimes from Ms. Diaz and sometimes from city residents, that, well, we don't have income requirements, so, we could have doctors and lawyers living in there and a whole bunch of rich people living in rent-stabilized units. Knowing the people that live here, there certainly might be some doctors and lawyers, but for the most part, it's a lot of people who need and appreciate the lower income units that are provided by rent stabilization, and that there are, it's few and far between that we have people who are of high income and living in the apartments, at least along Maple Avenue in Tacoma Park. So that might be a way of assessing the rent stabilization program and the income levels of the people who are enjoying the benefits of the rent stabilization program. Obviously, that's not a question for you, but suggestion to the council. You mentioned that you want to take a little bit of time to stabilize the building and to, I think you mentioned, I wrote down a quote here, that it's not performing well. That could mean a lot of things in a housing unit. It could mean there's a lot of vacancies. It could mean that a lot of different things. I wonder if you could just briefly tell us what that does mean to you, that it's not performing well, and kind of what the condition of the building is.
Yeah, I think, as I mentioned, there's a fair amount of deferred maintenance, in terms of the elevator, in terms of, other aspects of the building. The other aspect, and so we have some immediate money that we feel needs to be put into the building right away. On the one hand, it's a solid building, but on the other hand, it's just not necessarily managed extremely well. It appears that, from what I understand, the other thing I'd say is that one of the things that we've noted is extremely high water bills. And, in a sense, as we looked a little behind the walls, that, pipes have been sort of, that there have been some pinhole leaks or other things that have been sort of done with sort of quick fixes with sort of rubber and clamps and things like that. And that, and I think all along Maple, that's been a problem. I mean, we've had that problem at Edinburgh, and I know others have had some of that problem. So
yeah, that was my next question. You've done several buildings now that you've purchased here in Tacoma Park, as you mentioned, both along Maple Avenue and also in wards 5 and 6 in Tacoma Park. And would you say that's a common characteristic of the buildings that you're picking up in Tacoma Park?
Yes. I mean, in terms of the condition of the building.
It's hard to say that, but I think that's the case. That I don't know that I would call the place a dump, but it has serious infrastructure problems. with elevators that go out frequently and remain out of service for a while, has problems with the water system, problems with the HVAC systems. And so I would ask my colleagues on the council and the mayor if maybe we could have schedule a work session to discuss with the housing department how that happens. I mean, how do our buildings, well, if it's rent stabilization, maybe there's a problem with rent stabilization, or maybe it's a problem with our code enforcement, and maybe we don't have the policies and the laws that we need, and that our code enforcement should be looking at other things, such as the workman-like quality of the repairs that are done to the water system, so that we don't have, chewing gum plugging the holes and allowing the building to degrade into such a high level of disrepair that when it changes ownership, that a large investment has to be put in to do the work that should have been done along the way. So I would ask that we talk about that and see what are the changes, and maybe Councilmember Clay will be able to convince everybody that rent stabilization is the problem. I'm not sure that's what it is.
I'm not sure I have enough Advil for another round of that.
Well, that's why I don't think you should bring it up when we have the discussion about the maintenance. I guess that's it for my questions. I appreciate the work that you do. I think what we've seen has been excellent quality for the buildings when you are done. You, as you said a week or so ago, you didn't do well with the Edinburgh, in that you planned for doing minimal maintenance in the beginning, and now realizing that you have to come back and do it right. I see a big difference between that and what you're doing with the Maple View, because you're not standing there saying we're going to do minimal repairs and think that's going to work. You already know that you're going to have to come back and do something more major. So I thank you.
First, just let me say, as we were just talking about the water pipes, I think a lot of that has to do with the pinhole leaks that have been a problem for many people's water pipes. And I'm not sure that WSSC or other water utilities in the rest of the country have ever come up with a generally accepted answer for why that problem is. It just appears to be a problem. So that I know a lot of buildings, particularly built in the 60s, but sometimes even newer, have those problems. And so I'm not sure we can generalize from water pipe problems about general maintenance issues. I have to tell you, my reaction to this pilot honestly was, wow, is MHP going to come to own most of the apartment units in Tacoma Park? If the model for financing these is continual requests for pilots, are we prepared to give up on tax money from a lot of large buildings? How viable is that model for us to continue? It gets at the question of how we provide affordable housing, how much affordable housing we provide in the area, in the county, and whether it's financially viable for us to continue down this path. It's not a simple answer, but it caused me to kind of pull up short and go, is this sustainable for us, for our budget, for how we go forward, particularly with the impact of basically doubling the amount of pilot of the highest level that we've had in any one year, and going forward that way with that big increase for 10 years. My reaction was, if I'm going to support a pilot for this, it would have to be a lot less than 100%. I'm not sure what that figure is that I could be comfortable with. I've thought in my own mind, is it 50%? And I've thought in my own mind, is it 25%? I know that other levels of government or other investors who are providing financing want to see support from local government. So where I come out on this is not being comfortable with 100% pilot. I'm not particularly comfortable at saying no, 0, but I'm probably comfortable at some reduced level. And your timing on this is that you need us to do something about this right away, correct?
Yeah, we're trying to close by the end of the year.
So we essentially need to do it before we go on recess after the 29th. We tentatively have something on the agenda for next week on this item. If we were to go forward with something next week, I think we would need to figure out how we want to go forward. Councilmember Schultz will be back next week. Councilmember Snipper will not be here. What's people's feeling on this at this point if we had to determine how we want to go forward? I guess my sense is we should see, whether there's a majority for a particular position to go forward, and if there is, we'll go forward with it.
This is an important building in our city. It is one that has been in disrepair for quite some time, and I am very pleased with the work that Montgomery Housing Partnership has done, both in the city and outside the city. I think that they meet the reasonable, affordable housing goals, and I think that there aren't a lot of alternatives. There aren't a lot of other organizations coming to the table with a plan on taking these buildings that are in such disrepair and making them into livable housing units that fit within the affordable housing guidelines. And so I strongly support this. I would support the request as stated.
And just let me say that I don't disagree with much of what you said, but I still have to gulp when I think about the financial implications for what we have to deal with the overall budget. Councilmember Snipper.
Thank you, Mayor. Yeah, I've been thinking about this one, too. I'm kind of in the middle on it. I can see easily supporting a 50% pilot for this one.
Councilmember Wright.
I would suggest we just do, count it down. How many people for 100%, how many people for 75, 50, and see at which point you get a majority or not. And go home.
99?
I was going to do that, but I wanted to give people opportunities to say more. How many people are for a 100% pilot for 10 years as requested? Okay, that's not a majority. How many people for 50 for 10 years? You have to do your hand on that one, too. I think. You don't have any company for 100, so you're going for the next higher level. So I see 2 for 50. How many for 25? I still only see 2. How many
for 80?
How many for something between 25 and 0? There's 3. How many for 0?
You're not getting me to raise my hand on that. That feels like I've been set up.
I wanted, the zeros were a little slow there. I want to do 0.
What's the rest of us?
I think there were 3.
Colleen and Josh and me.
So at this point, we don't have 4 people for anything, is my sense of the count.
Better call Fred.
So I guess what has to be done is that the staff has to draft a resolution and bring it back, and when it comes for first reading, then we can fill in the blank on what the percentage is.
Well, but if it's zero, there's nothing to bring forward.
Well, but you're not going to know that unless somebody brings something here that we vote on.
Well,
Councilmember Siemens might have conversations with other council members.
He might indeed.
Where he might make a persuasive argument that some member would.
Yeah.
That's what I think he's asking for.
Like, could I mow your lawn? Things like that. Rake your leaves.
I would never be so susceptible to straightforward
bribery.
You have to be more subtle than that.
Is there any information
promise I'll make you a better
staff
offer.
can provide that will help you make your decision? Is there?
Does anybody need any additional information from staff?
Not for me.
I think we're up in the air on this one. We'll see where things fall out next week, unless we want to do it the 29th, when all 7 of us should be here.
I do actually have one thing that would be
2 readings, so we need to do it next week.
I do have one piece of information. I'd be curious to know what the property was purchased for by the current holder, and if we know what their current outstanding debt or liability on the property is. Sorry, what was?
Let's see. You're talking about 1987? What the purchase price was?
Tired to look. I want to know the purchase price, and if possible, I don't know if there's a way to figure out what the outstanding debt is on the property.
Okay. Well, the purchase price was $1,850,000 in 1987. And in terms of the debt, I'm not sure if we'll be able to find that out. I mean, I do know that, for instance, this year, there have been 4 notices for utility turnoffs that were, given to the tenants.
Before that, too.
And there have been many others before that. The owner has not had a rental license since 2006, and one of the problems is that he doesn't pay his license fee, or there's 5 requirements to obtain a license in Tacoma Park, and there's usually one of those items or more of those items that the owner currently hasn't done. The inspection that took place this year started in January and was at last completed in August. Okay, so it took 8 months to get the owner to complete the inspection, and at the beginning of the inspection process, there were over 450 violations that were noted. So there, as Mr. Goldman has been saying, there is...
My interest in the questions I asked was not to understand how bad a landlord the person is. Clearly, he's a bad landlord, but was to try and understand more what the economic motivations of the seller might be. And things like the level of debt would help to determine that.
Well, he may have refinanced 10 times and then gotten debt up to his eyeballs.
Right, he might be.
Not put any of it into the building.
Exactly. He might have done that, and he might have a lot of debt, and there might be a number at which he wouldn't sell because he'd have to... He's upside down. But the converse might be true, that he doesn't have a lot of debt, and he might be motivated to sell. He might be happier to have $6 million, or he might be just as happy to have $6 million versus whatever is the 6,795 at this point. I don't think there's a lot of people clamoring to buy properties that require a significant amount of maintenance and upkeep, and with very little upside on the rental side because they can't increase the rents.
Linda, I've heard that maybe the owner wasn't enthusiastic about selling to begin with, that he's been put in a position where he has to sell. Do we know anything about that? I mean, that's kind of the rumor in the building.
No, we haven't had any contact with the owner.
Okay, and it is actually the owner selling, it's not, it hasn't been taken over by a mortgage company or any other entity. And then my other question is, how, and maybe Rob has to answer this, is how was the building sold? Was it at an auction, or, so it was just put on the market and you made an offer?
Right.
Okay.
It was put on the market by an agent, a real estate agent, and no, it's not in a short sale or foreclosure.
Okay, so if there's other offers, we may think that there's other offers, but we don't, there's nothing, no public record that there's other offers or what the amount of those offers are.
Right. No, we have no information
Okay,
about that.
so it would be just purely speculation that there might be somebody else interested in the building at this point.
Right. We don't know.
Oh, thank you.
We're adjourned.